so much for joining. Today, as we just wait for everyone else to come online and to get the full use presentation, I'm going to do some quick introductions, some housekeeping, and then we can kick into the actual webinar presentation. My name's Jimmy. I'm with the marketing team here at Switch, and today we're going to be delivering a webinar, Effortless EV charging for your property. So that means we're going to be trying to talk about as many property types as we can in this conversation, but please make sure to ask any questions about your specific property type as we go along as well. We're going to be talking building and electrical considerations, technology and software, funding and incentives, installation and operation, hardware, software, all of that and much more. So we'll cover all those basics of what you need to know. And if you have any specific queries as we go, please do ask those questions. So that brings me nicely to housekeeping for the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. Please make sure to use that throughout if you've got any queries or questions about anything we are talking about. This entire webinar will also be recorded, questions and all, and sent to you all afterwards. So if you miss anything, or you want to recap on anything that we've gone through, you'll be able to receive that recording and go through it in your own time. So to quickly introduce, we've got Jeremy and Thomas, who will be your presenters today. I'm just the MC there to keep things going here, but they are the experts that will actually run you through this. Jeremy is our Director of Real Estate Partnerships, and Thomas is Director of Sales Engineering. So we've got the operations and the technical insights there, all the expertise you could need to answer your questions. But before we kick off, I've got one quick question that I'd really like to get everyone to answer, just to help us understand the level of knowledge in the audience today. Really simple, yes or no question. Do you currently have any EV chargers installed at your property or properties? Or if you're an electrician or a partner, have you installed any chargers at any properties? Would love just to get any yes or no's in the chats. Really helps us to delve into what sort of stage you are at. Thank you so much for getting that through. The more we get through, the more we can make sure this really applies to all of you. So thanks so much for those questions, for those answers. Like I said, make sure to answer any questions that you have as we go through. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jeremy and Thomas to take away with the webinar.
Perfect. Thanks, Jimmy. Thank you for everyone who has tuned into the webinar for Effortless EV charging for your property. Just by way of introduction, I'm Jeremy Cohen, Director of Real Estate Partnerships here at Switch. It's really my role in the organization. I deal with a lot of owners and operators, developers of real estate to help them with their EV charging strategy. You know, no two buildings are the same, no two properties, no two portfolios. So we like to look at holistically and just say, where is the best way to deploy and help them out? Thomas?
Hey everybody, my name is Thomas Martin, and I'm on the solution side of Switch, meaning I work on the team that figures out how to get it in your building, given all the technical requirements, unique attributes, any concerns. So in terms of building the solution, that's where I come in. And on today's webinar, I'm hopefully going to give you a good picture of what to look for when scoping a project in your building. For those who have answered, you do not have EV charging in your building today. And I think for the goal of our presentation is to arm you with the content and the questions that will enable you to get yourself procuring a project and asking vendors the right questions, whether it be Switch or another company. And so from an educational point of view, Jeremy and I are going to walk you through each step, and hopefully you'll be taking notes and writing down some of those key takeaways for each step along the way.
Perfect. Thanks, Thomas. So we have an action-packed agenda for everyone today. We're going to cram it in there. And throughout the presentation, we wanted to make it dynamic. We didn't want you to just hear a little bit of me and a little bit of Thomas. So what we did was we peppered questions throughout the presentation of questions that I'm typically fielding through my discoveries with owners and operators and developers of all types of real estate assets. And Thomas will help walk you through some of that from a technical standpoint and as well as an implementation standpoint. So we'll talk about EV charging now, the key questions to consider, the system itself. Thomas will take a deep dive into the hardware and the software and just the path forward. It's kind of our ethos, and you'll hear this many times throughout the presentation: the plan, the install, the manage, and the service. So let's get into it. Little bit about SWTCH for those of you who are not familiar. SWTCH is an EV charging solutions company. So we provide the software and the hardware to properties with their EV chargers to make them smart. So we have over 18,000 chargers out there on the SWTCH network, a remarkable uptime of 99.7%. And we're just very fortunate for a lot of these ownership groups that instill their trust in us to deploy these wonderful assets and amenities at your buildings. So we wanted to take a big snapshot of the asset classes. So on the screen, you can see multifamily, workplace, retail, parking, hospitality, you name it. The EV charging wave is here, and it is affecting all asset classes across the board. And if you're an owner and operator of real estate, depending on whatever asset class you may own in or operate in, EV charging is touching this asset class in some which way, shape, or form. So we want to make you prepared. We want to make you knowledgeable, and we want to help you deploy because they're not going anywhere. This wave is happening now. So as I said before, you'll hear from us a couple times throughout the presentation of what we call the design stage. So that's going at a given property, seeing what's the best way or where's the best locations to put these chargers. Then obtaining a quote. Quote is as simple as working with SWTCH, as well as a qualified electrician or installation partner who has experience installing these chargers. The installation itself, because there are some nuances to that. And then lastly, the manage process. Once these chargers are in the ground, how are we managing them? Because the name of the game has changed. These chargers are going to live at your property, and you're going to want to know everything that's going on with the chargers at a given property or across a portfolio. And we'll dive into that a little bit more in a bit. So the big question is, why EV charging now? And I'm sure many of you have read the headlines, you've read news. Again, the EV wave is here. So let's prepare you for that. And what we did, in addition to many of the questions that I'm going to ask Thomas that I hear, we want to hit you with stats. I think stats are really a great indicator of what's happening out there. So EV sales are projected to hit 53% of all cars by 2030. This is happening in real time. Each year, the uptick is happening more and more. And those cars are going to be parking somewhere, right? It depends on what asset it is. Those cars are going to dwell. And 80% of these cars charging are happening where everyone is dwelling. So if you're at a multifamily property, you live at the property, your car is dwelling there for long periods of time. You go to your office at work, you're dwelling from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And you're dwelling in other assets too. But we just want to let you know, wherever the car is parked is opportunities for you to potentially deploy chargers to charge these cars. Everyone always says, yes, EV chargers sounds great, going to be expensive. Well, what I'll talk you through a little bit are some of these active incentive and rebate programs that are happening either on a federal level or on a state and city level to make it way more palatable to put these chargers in the ground. Because again, the time is now. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a bit as well. So the plan, as I mapped out a little bit earlier, you're going to design, you're going to install, you're going to manage. We'll walk you through a couple of these key questions to consider if it's your first time. And I see just through the chat, there are a bunch of first timers here. So let's get to the key questions that you should be asking each time you go to install these chargers. So Thomas, biggest question I get asked when I am out there: what type of chargers are available and what do I need?
Good question. And before we answer what you need, we first need to understand the different types and what the major differences are between them. And for those who are new to the space, there are three different types of charging speeds, or levels that we like to call them. Level one is the equivalent to plugging your vehicle in to the outlet that your computer's plugged into right now, the 120 volt outlet that you plug your kettle into. It's accessible, it's affordable, they exist today, but the problem is it's not going to charge your car very quickly. And so the benefit here is that for places where you're in a pinch, let's say you're at your friend's house, at a cottage, at an Airbnb out of town, this is a solution if you're going to be spending some time and can top up over a number of days. But this isn't the solution for the masses. Level 2 is the most common. It's the grand majority of charging stations in the field, and I'll explain why. This is because it's the right intersection of price point and performance, meaning it'll take your car 4 to 6 hours to charge, depending on the size of the vehicle. And it is using infrastructure and voltage or electricity that is already existing in the building. So it does not need transformers and a lot of these big expensive components in the building. And so for dwell times longer than an hour, this is typically your go-to solution in terms of product type. But we still have the fast charging, which can often be referred to as level 3 or DC fast. This has a lot of great applications, the most common being your shopping malls, your major highway routes. And this is good for the short dwell times, let's say sub 30 minutes, where you're on the go, you need to charge so that you can move on with your day. The benefit here is you're charging very quickly, but the downside is there is a higher CapEx involved for all the infrastructure required to get that speed to the vehicle. And this is exactly why we don't see them in every single parking space. The unit economics aren't as favorable to put in a bank of stations when you could have a bank of level 2s for a fraction of the cost. But we'll get into the differences.
So again, now we're understanding the different types of chargers that are out there. Then it's going to come into, well, how many chargers should you install? And that can vary, because I think the good snapshot is how many should you install? If you're an owner and operator of real estate, there are a couple ways to look at this. We know the statistics, 53% of cars are going to be EV, close to 2030. But the best snapshot or indicator of that are your tenants. So many owners and operators really haven't looked at the lot, as I call it. This is a great opportunity. Send out a survey of the tenants. Simple questions. How many of you have EV cars? For those of you that have EV cars, how likely are you to charge at our property if we install EV chargers? For those of you that don't have EV cars, how likely are you to get EV cars? And if you do, would you use the chargers? It's just a really good indicator for you to have that rapport with your tenants to gauge it. Now, outside of how many should you, which was on the last slide, the reality, or where the rubber hits the road, as I say, is how many chargers can you actually install at the building? And Thomas is about to walk you through how many you actually can install based off of the current electrical capacity that is at a given building. So, Thomas.
Yeah, that's typically the first step. A lot of the time we get asked the question, an electrician came by my building, years ago and told me there is simply no room on the existing infrastructure for EV chargers. We can almost guarantee that any building can take them today. It's more about the how do we do it and what technology do we have available to us to do that most efficiently. And we're going to get into what I mean by that in a second.
Now, in addition to how many can you actually install, budget is always one of the biggest conversation, either starters or enders. So if you're an owner and operator of real estate, one, you're looking at your capital stack. How much available capital do you have on hand? Now, some owners and operators look at installing the EV chargers in a couple different ways. Some want to know how quickly they're going to get paid back for sinking that CapEx. Some will look at it and say, okay, this was an OpEx for me. Some are going to say, I don't care so much because I'm offering this great amenity. Some are saying, well, maybe if I put these in, this is a amenity that's going to be a tenant attractor, or maybe it's going to be a tenant retention tool. So many different owners and operators are looking at it multiple ways, and there's so many ways to slice and dice the budget conversation. And as I alluded to earlier, there are a ton of available incentives and rebates that are out there that can help really just get these projects in the ground quickly for fractions of the cost. And we'll get to that even more on later slides as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Thomas right now, who's going to take a deep dive into what we call the system, and that is the actual EV charging hardware and software. So Thomas, more questions. Can you just buy a level 2 charger, install them, and just start charging?
Yeah, good question. And the answer is yes, but you may not like what happens when you do that. And what I mean by that is if you install any level 2 charger, you can buy them at Home Depot, for example, install it on the wall and let people start charging, you're going to very soon realize that you have no way to control what happens with those stations. And what I mean by that is you have no way to bill for energy. You have no way to control who and when they're accessed. And that is exactly why we like to communicate the 4 key pillars to value behind a charging station. And so we're going to talk about specifically what each segment is and how it's bringing value to the property on top of just the physical device being added to that parking stall. As far as we're concerned, putting the charger on the wall is only a fraction of the thought that we need to put into to make for a successful installation. So we're going to start by talking about the device and the infrastructure.
More questions for Thomas. What should I look for when purchasing a level 2 charger?
If there's one thing you take away from this question, it's the use of open standards in the EV charging industry. I like to equate it to the cell phone analogy, where at the beginning, the networks locked you in on that specific cell phone. Whereas today, you can move between AT&T and Verizon without actually having to swap that physical phone yourself. Same applies here with charging stations. Anything that operates on the OCPP standard can be brought between networks without having to rip that device off the wall. And so the question you want to ask any vendor that you're speaking to is, can the device that I'm purchasing be brought between networks without any payment or added work? The reason we like to promote this as an industry standard is because it gives the property or the building the freedom of choice for who they're working with, and they're not subject to financial penalties if for whatever reason the service isn't good. And so what this allows you to do is change your telecom provider, so to speak, without actually having to buy new expensive hardware. As you can see, we work with all the major brands of hardware in North America. Our role in the hardware conversation is to provide our best recommendation given price point, reliability, and availability. And so you can think of us as a trusted resource there. And we're not necessarily going to push a unit that we have preference to. We're going to lay them all out and let you feel like you have enough information to choose a unit that is right for your building. But at the end of the day, they all charge a car, which is what we're trying to do here.
Thank you, Thomas. More questions that I hear out in the field. What are other considerations that are needed in addition to just the EV charger?
So if you look back, we're talking right now about the EV charger and hardware within those 4 pillars of value that they bring to the building. So we just talked about the EV chargers themselves. So physically, what devices and accessories are we adding to the property? In this photo here, for an outdoor install, you're looking at a dual port station on a pole with cable retractors. And so in the space of accessories, we want to make sure that the EV charging installation maintains itself in a neat, orderly fashion. The cables aren't on the ground. If you were to let go of the cable retractor pulls it back up to a neat position, things like this. The second part being the electrical. You can work with your trusted building electrician, or you can hire in somebody that is typically doing EV charging installs and has a lot of experience behind doing it the most efficient way. But the electrical is typically going to represent 50 to 60% of your total cost. And this is why it's important to have a good trusted partner that has experience doing this type of work in a building, because they're going to find efficiencies that a newer electrician may not necessarily be accustomed to. Something that's typically overlooked when you're scoping a project is, how do we get internet connectivity to the parking garage? You might be asking, why do I need internet for the connectivity? 2 reasons. Since these devices are going to be pay-per-use, or they might not be, We still need to talk to them to make sure that they're online and available. Or in the event of a problem, the device can tell our system there's a problem and it may need to be swapped out for service. And so internet connectivity is not something you want to overlook in the proposal phase. And there's a number of ways to do that. And we're happy, Jeremy and I are happy to talk more about what options are available. This typically represents a fraction of the total cost, but if you don't plan ahead, it can start to balloon and become a more significant cost, which is not ideal. And then finally, the software. The software is what brings the value to operating stations without having to assign additional resources. And what I mean by that is once the charges are set up, ideally, you do not have to be checking in on them regularly, maybe once a quarter, once every 6 months, to just confirm that the behavior of the drivers is matching the intentions of how you set up the pricing, the access policy, whether or not you implemented loitering features. And that's what the software is really here to do. The software is one component of the total package. And so next, let's talk more about what that software actually does. The software is the second pillar of value that we're bringing to the building. And so let's maybe dive a little bit more into what that means.
More questions. Why do you need software to manage these simply they're large electrical outlets? Why are we making it more complex than it needs to be, Thomas? Well,
yeah, I can answer this one. Before I answer why do I need software, let's ask ourselves these questions, or ask yourself these questions. Who is going to be accessing these charging stations? How do I know how much revenue those charging stations have made? How does the driver pay for electricity that the vehicle consumes? What happens if all the charging stations are on at the same time? And the thinking here is electrical load. What if the driver leaves a car in the parking spot? And finally, how do I know if something breaks? The answer to all of those questions is not, assign somebody to figure it out for you. The answer is there's software that exists to do this all for you in an automated and clean fashion. And that's exactly why we offer Switch OS on top of all of our stations. You can think of this as not another tool that you need to learn how to use and master, but rather the mechanism to deploy an EV charging system in your building and set it up to best guide the behavior of the drivers. So a good example of this is for a public lot that might not want vehicles spending overnight charging on the premises, we can set a fixed charging schedule or time period so that after 8 p.m., they're not available. Or in the case of a shopping mall that sees high traffic, we could set a 2-hour limit. After the 2 hours, you incur a loitering penalty. Or in the case of visitor parking at a multifamily residential building, only visitors that have verified with the concierge can have access. And so all of these can be set up in the initial stages of the deployment. And like I said, you check in on them with the data and all the transactions once every 6 months, once every year. It's not meant to be another tool to add to the workload.
Okay. Peppering you with more questions, Thomas.
Yeah.
This is one I hear very often. And it's true. Buildings were not built 10, 20, 30 years ago thinking about EV charging. And there's so much old building stock out there. So one question I constantly get fielded or asked was, our buildings weren't built to handle the electricity from EV charging. Completely understand. And we can't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on new infrastructure. Completely understand. So it kind of goes back to how we started this whole conversation. How many chargers can you actually install versus satisfying the demand without breaking the bank? It's that seesaw, right?
Yeah. And so practically, we can put an EV charger physically in each stall. There's space for it. But the question I asked earlier was, what happens if they all turn on at the same time? And that's where we bring in, or we introduce, the concept of energy management. Energy management, in short, is the way to control when the chargers in the vehicles pull energy from the building. And so in this diagram we have on screen, we use a multifamily building example because if everyone comes home at the end of the day and plugs in and starts drawing power, it will also coincide with the building's peak. And this is where things get expensive. Not because we're paying premium electrical rates, but rather in order to install the infrastructure to support this, it gets very expensive. And so energy management is a tool to control when charging happens and push it into areas that we would otherwise not be consuming energy. And this will depend building to building. So on screen, I'm going to pull up an animation. So pay attention to what's happening. But as you start to add EV charging to the building, you're slowly going to get closer and closer to the limit of transformers, panels, switchboards, whatever it might be. And eventually you're going to hit the limit of that piece of infrastructure. And the goal isn't to install more. The goal is to control when charging happens to stay within the capacity of that panel, transformer, switchboard, whatever it might be, and follow the natural load profiles of those devices or assets. And so in the context of this, we're shifting power to be consumed by the chargers in vehicles when there is excess capacity overnight. I know I used a multifamily example. This can also be applied to commercial. This also can be applied to workplace. And the idea is that we're going to look at the building's profile and basically set the algorithm to charge the vehicles when there is excess capacity available to us without incurring a big infrastructure bill to get the pipe installed, so to speak. And so finally, that brings us to the last of the 4 key pillars or value that we're bringing to the second last, which is what is the experience like for the EV drivers? And so at the end of the day, the goal is to give EV drivers a way to use the stations, to pay, and in the event there's a problem, get help. And so there's a number of ways we do this. We have the mobile app, which is most common. I will highlight, you do not need to download this app. This is only for drivers that prefer to use it. Let's say if it's in your building or at your favorite spot that you frequent, you can download an app for a very seamless experience. But you can also use a web app, meaning you go on the browser on your phone or scan the QR code, and you do not need to download an app. You can simply check out as a guest. Just like you would with any online retailer, you don't have to create an account. You click out check out as a guest, you input your payment information and email for a receipt, and you can move on with your day. We definitely have heard the drivers' feedback of app fatigue, so we are definitely not trying to push people to download the app as an essential item to the EV chargers. And finally, RFID cards. If you want to use an RFID card, you can request one from Switch at no added cost.
Thanks, Thomas. So you touched on this a little bit before, but how do the EV drivers pay for the electricity used if I'm an owner and operator of real estate?
Yeah, basically the function of Switch here is we're collecting money from the drivers. We put that into a virtual bank account, and then we deposit that back to the building or whatever bank account that the building prefers. So in this case, you can think of it like sub-metering. We're collecting the amount of money that Jeremy would use, and then we're giving it back to the building to pay for that common element, electricity. Every EV charger does have a meter built inside of it, so we know every kilowatt hour to the decimal that flows through that device.
How does EV charging interact with other technologies in the building?
This one we can definitely fill another hour on, but Jeremy and I picked kind of a couple key examples to highlight what's possible here. We've done projects with Ani Group, who uses flash parking as their parking operator. And what we're able to do is integrate with that parking solution technology and allow users to pay for parking and charging through the same experience, meaning you don't have to open 2 different apps. Another example is working with Smart One, a smart building concierge company, where the residents in the building use the Smart One app to access doors, Amazon packages, unlock parking garages, things like that. They can also start an EV charger through that app. So again, they don't have to download another app to integrate with EV charging. And then finally, CSC. They operate laundry services in hundreds of thousands of buildings nationwide. And for users that use the CSC technology to do laundry and other services in the building, they can now start an EV charger through that experience that they're familiar with. And again, we're not forcing them to use another app. And so the goal here is tenant experience or guest experience, and having to allow them to use means that they're already familiar with to access the EV chargers in the building.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. I can take the fourth pillar, O&M support. You know, one of the things we consistently hear is, I sunk the capital, I put these chargers in the ground, they're being managed. What if something breaks? How do we monitor these things? So again, reliability is everything. Have a plan. You know, typically these chargers, as Thomas alluded to, they're pretty inexpensive. The software is managing them 99.9% of the time for uptime. There's that 0.1% where things do go down. So the software alone is going to make sure that we know if there's a problem. And 99.9.7% of the time, we actually know that there's a problem before ownership or operators know. And we've remoted in and we've handled that problem. In the very, very few instances where we cannot provide that ongoing service and support via the software, we will send a dedicated technician out there, typically the installation group who installed the chargers initially, to go out there. And maybe it's a damaged plug or someone accidentally bumped into it, but we handle that. And you definitely want to have a plan for that because, again, hardware sometimes breaks. And that's just the truth of the matter of it.
And Jeremy, I'll just add one more point here on the slide. You talked about network uptime, but there's two stats that we like to break this out into. And because it provides more clarity to where are problems happening with chargers in the field. There's network uptime that you can think of it as all of the switch software, which is our responsibility. And then there's the charging station that's on site and what's its uptime. And we really like to separate these two values to show people that there's a lot of things that can go wrong here. And that is why the software is needed to diagnose and troubleshoot and resolve issues rather than having to, send someone to site, which can get expensive very quickly.
Great. So the path forward, we've said this multiple times throughout this presentation, but again, it's the 4 pillars that if it's your first time going at this, just consider it, right? Have the initial plan. How are we installing them? How are we managing the chargers? And the available service that is out there to make sure that there's consistent uptime. Remember these 4 things. So as I said on some past slides before, we want to assess the demand because you may have no EV cars at your current property and you may have a ton of EV cars and you might be somewhere in the middle, but you want to make sure that when you're going to install the chargers that you're not under installing the amount. Because as we know from the past, EV adoption is happening. And as we're going to get to in the next couple slides, there are available incentives, rebates out there to make the cost of installing these way more palatable. So Thomas, next slide, please. Wanted to give you guys a really good snapshot of what's happening across the US right now. So there are over 314 active incentive programs that are going on. And as you can see, California has always been the leader in electrification. Electric cars on the road, EV chargers installed, you name it. But as you start to look at the rest of the US, don't count out a lot of other states that are making this happen. And a lot of these other states are leveraging available incentives and rebates that are out there, typically through the utility companies, to get more chargers in the ground. And this can vary on a city, on a state, a utility-wide basis. And we don't want you to be overwhelmed because navigating some of these incentives and rebate programs are complex. We're very fortunate at Switch that we have a team that's just dedicated to handling this alone because there are so many nuances. But at the end of the day, we just want to make sure that we are grabbing the free money because eventually the well is going to run dry. And you don't want to be left saying, I should have taken advantage of that while it was free capital to put these in, because later down the road, it's just going to cost more to get these chargers in the ground. Now, outside of what's going on at a city or a state or a utility level, through the Biden-Harris administration, there's what's called the Alternative Fuel Vehicle Refueling Property Tax Credit, which is an absolute mouthful, which is also known as the 30C tax credit. And that happens on a census-wide track or per zip code basis, where there's a map of the US, and simply putting in your desired property will let you know if that site qualifies for the 30C tax credit. And it's incredible. It's about $100,000 off a potential CapEx project, or 30% of the tax bill. And again, Switch has the resources and the team behind us to help us furnish those available incentives and rebates on behalf of the property, and make sure that you receive that money for installing the project within a 30C tax credit zone. Thomas?
Yep.
Perfect. So again, don't want to beat a dead horse, but again, plan. Know what's going on with the electrical, how you're going to look at your hardware and your software options and the incentives that are out there. Then, working with a qualified electrician, let's get these things installed, whether they're in a garage, an outdoor parking lot, so on and so forth. Rely on the software to manage these chargers, because now they went from being just an outlet to a smart charger. And just know that you will always be blanketed and covered with support should anything happen to these once the chargers are in the ground. Wow, that went quick, I have to say.
Thank you so much for both of you. That was incredibly insightful, always helpful to have you both as experts on. So some great questions asked during that. If anyone has any last questions they want to get in, please add them to the chat now, and we'll make sure we get around to them. Before I kick into that, I just wanted to bring up a subject as well. We talked a lot about US incentives and rebates there as well, but we also cover all of North America, so Canada as well. So we do have incentives and rebates available north of the border. So if you'd like to know about any of those, you can also get in touch. In general, incentives, very complex, a lot of them out there. We have a tool that we can use to find ones in your local area, and we'll assess them. So by all means, please get in touch and we can help you understand that and work through it. So getting into some questions. First question from Eric. How often are you putting in dedicated electrical panels for a charging hub? And off the back of that, how often are you putting in a dedicated, oh, sorry, no, I just copied that one. Let's go straight back to that. How often are you putting in dedicated electrical panels for charging?
Yeah, it'll depend on the size of the installation, but the way I think of it is the panel is just a means to connect chargers, and we can give that panel as much power as we need. And so in the event we're installing, 2 or 4 stations, the goal is to try and hook up to existing infrastructure as best we can. And what we can do is add what we call our load management system switch control to an existing panel, which will allow the EV chargers to only consume energy when that panel has excess capacity. So it'll fluctuate based on when the light turns on, garage door, garbage compactor, you name it. But for larger installations, let's say we're doing 20 or 30 at a time, we'll likely run a higher voltage line out to the direction of the EV chargers, and then branch it out with a panel to minimize our circuit runs. And so, like I said earlier, the panel is a means to connect, and there's a number of things that we can do to minimize, conduit run, copper, things like that. And so it'll depend on the uniqueness of the property and the install, and that's where my team comes in. We come in and try and figure that out with you.
Brilliant. And another question that follows up quite nicely from Eric. Is there a minimum amp per charger you recommend when using power management and those setups?
There's not a minimum, but we like to communicate it to the property as what is the minimum performance that a user would expect at this property. So for example, a multifamily building, we're going to be spending lots of time there. They can get away with spending a couple hours at the lower ends, like let's say 8 or 6 amps. We can go further than that, but we want to balance the performance and the user experience together. And so that power requirement is typically a conversation that we want to have with the property on what the expectations will be with the drivers. But to answer your question specifically, we can go right down to zero if we need.
Next question is from Laura. Do you take a cut of the payment that drivers make? And I just guess that's just a good chance as well to talk about pricing and how Switch works into that realm of revenue too.
No, Laura, we do not take a cut of the payment that drivers make. So what we do is we'll collect all the revenue that's made off of the chargers, whether it be monthly or quarterly. And the only thing that we will take out is we'll take out the Stripe credit card processing fee. And then we will remit payment back to ownership. It's pretty much as a pass-through. It's kind of what makes Switch. There are some other providers out there that their model is based off of dipping their hand into the cookie jar, if we will. That is not us. We want to do what's right. It's the ownership's revenue. It's the ownership's electricity. And we'll just remit all the revenue back. Just take out the Stripe credit card processing fee.
Brilliant. Question from Sahar. You showed multiple companies that provide charging stations. They're all providing level 2. What is the main difference between these providers and what should you be looking for if you wanted to choose one?
Yeah, good question. The main things you're looking for, in my opinion, or I guess in Switch's opinion, is what are the tried and tested models? Everything that I had back on that slide that I can, I don't know if you want to take a photo of that. These models on screen have tens of thousands deployed, and you could think of them as the Toyota Corolla of EV chargers. What we tend to avoid is offering models that are fresh to market, just knowing how, sometimes we have to work out the bugs or work out the kinks. And so, there's common brands like LG. They make everything from TVs to EV chargers. And then there's less known brands like Light-On that don't necessarily have a brand presence, but they sell through white labeled contracts. So I guess the main thing that you're looking for is the power amperage. The main categories are 32, 40, 48, and 80. And then whether or not it's a station alone or integrated with a pedestal. This one in the center here, you can see it's a full pedestal. You're going to pay a bit more for that. But if you're mounting charging stations on a concrete wall in a multifamily building or a parking garage, you're likely want to go with just a wall mount because you're going to save some money there. Our job here at Switch, we'll provide you a list of recommendations, and our job is to make it easy. Like I said, this is one small component of the overall value that we're bringing to the building.
Brilliant. And just to touch on that, a question from Laura. No idea how much even one charger would cost to install. Do we have any ballpark, I guess, on cost of charger and roughly, I guess, on pricing for installs, just knowing that sometimes it's installing 2, sometimes it's installing 10, what that sort of means for pricing?
Yeah, I can take that one. I mean, not to be vague, Laura, at all, but it all depends on the quantity of chargers that are being out there. But most importantly, it's the quote from the installation partner or the electrician. So the EV charging equipment as a whole, not so expensive. And just to give you rough numbers, the physical charger that Thomas was just showing, maybe $1,000. Maybe the pedestal to put, one of those chargers on, maybe about $1,000. But where the cost does come into effect is the cost per charger from the installer. So we install chargers all over the country and all over North America, and each installation is so different. And just to give you real life examples, I've seen upwards of $5,000 to $7,000 per charger to install from quotes in New York to California. But then in Philadelphia, I saw a quote just to put one charger in was $2,000. So it just varies so much. The work needed to get the chargers in the ground varies. The distance to the electrical panel and how much wire and conduit you're going to run also varies. So each property and each building and each portfolio is so different. But we're happy to take a look and just see.
Brilliant. And last question from the chat. Amar, we have multiple family projects that are using our building management software. Is there any integration documentation, pricing information to provide drivers with a seamless experience? Great chance to go into, I guess, some of the existing integrations we have, but also what we can do as far as API and integrations.
Yeah, Amar, we can unpack that. We would just look into what system you're using and then what it would take. There is a bit of a spectrum in terms of what's possible. We can do on the simple end where, it's as easy as just clicking start, whereas you can go all the way where it pulls in data and analytics. I'll quickly jump to a slide here. We do another version of that with Marriott's hotel chain. We basically work in with their building management and location management and resident experience application. That's another example where they're using a Marriott branded experience to access the EV chargers. Whereas that slide I showed earlier with Flash Parking as well as Smart One, they're both using their building apps to integrate with the Switch EV charging system. So to unpack that, reach out to Jeremy's contact right here and we can engage and provide you with more documentation.
Brilliant. And then to finish that all up, then it would be great to hear, I guess, any common mistakes that you're seeing in past or current setups that are happening out there in the field, and just any thoughts on the industry as a whole in properties as we go along.
I can take that one to start. I'll take the technical angle. Jeremy, you can maybe finish off with a business angle. But the question that you want to ask from any vendor, whether it's Switch or another company, is can the chargers you are sourcing be moved to another network without any cost or added effort? This is really important for the industry in the long-term life of the asset, where you do not want to have a scenario where a company packs up and moves back to Europe or goes out of business and you're stuck with a stranded asset in the building. We've seen that happen a couple of times in the industry, and it makes for a lot of unhappy owners. And so OCPP being the protocol, but more importantly, can these chargers be migrated to another network at no cost is the question that you want to ask. That's your number one.
Brilliant. And any thoughts from you, Jeremy, on conversations you're having out there in the field?
Yeah, no, and Thomas hit on such a great point. From the real estate end of things, I would say if you're an owner, you're an operator, you're a developer, know what's going on in your local area. And I'll give you an example. If you're a developer, there are now so many codes required by cities and states to get these chargers in the ground at your building by these new codes that are saying you may need to put in X amount out of the gate just to make sure that your building is up to code with the amount of chargers necessary. There's also codes that are saying some need to be EV ready and EV capable, two totally different buckets. And I would also say if you're a real estate owner or operator, again, don't lowball the amount of chargers that you think you may need. Engage those tenants because it is highly likely that they're already driving the EV cars and they're likely going to get an EV car as their next one. So again, take those available incentives and rebates and install them now. And I'm being serious. I had conversations from 2 years ago where owners and operator groups that I was working with just said, you know what, we just want to dip our toe in the pond. We want to start with one or two. No problem. I got a call recently that said, you know what, we totally undershot it and we realized that we need it. That's great. It's a great problem to have, but the problem is they sank the money for the capital early. They took available incentive rebates that were happening 2 years ago, and now the scope has changed. So if you have this blank canvas to work of right now, and for those of you that chimed in the chat, you have nothing going on right now, overshoot and over deliver would be my parting words.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the cost per install. The cost from installing 2 chargers to 10 chargers doesn't dramatically increase, but you will have to respend that again in 3 years' time when you need more. Brilliant. Thank you both so much for that. Really insightful. We will be sending a follow-up email with this webinar recording, all the questions that were asked. You can go through, replay it at your own leisure. It will also have Jeremy's contact details in there if you need to get in touch. We've got teams across Canada and the US, so wherever you are based, we've got experts in each one of those areas, so we'll be able to forward you onto the right places. But yes, if there's any unanswered questions, please send them through, and we hope to talk to you all soon. Have a great day.